The world watched with bated breath as diplomats from the United States and Iran gathered in the Pakistani capital of Islamabad for what many hoped would be a historic turning point in one of the most dangerous and destructive conflicts the modern world has witnessed in recent decades. The talks, which stretched across an exhausting and tension-filled 21 hours, were meant to deliver something that millions of ordinary people on both sides of this war had been desperately praying for: a permanent end to the fighting, a signed agreement that would silence the guns, halt the missiles, and allow the wounded and the grieving to begin the long and painful process of rebuilding their shattered lives. Islamabad, a city known more for its own complex geopolitical struggles than for hosting the resolution of foreign wars, became the stage for a diplomatic marathon that the entire international community was monitoring with a mixture of hope and deep anxiety. Senior negotiators flew in from Washington and Tehran, carrying the weight of their nations on their shoulders, accompanied by legal teams, military advisors, and foreign policy architects who had spent weeks preparing position papers, red lines, and compromise frameworks that they believed could bridge the enormous gap between two countries that have viewed each other as adversaries for more than 4 decades. The ceasefire that had been holding, fragile and imperfect as it was, gave the diplomats a narrow window of opportunity, a brief pause in the bloodshed during which words could be exchanged instead of fire. And yet, when Sunday came and the talks finally concluded, what emerged from those closed rooms was not an agreement but a collapse. Not a handshake but a blame game, not peace but the terrifying sound of a fragile ceasefire cracking under the weight of mistrust, maximalist demands, and irreconcilable positions that neither side was willing to soften. The failure was not sudden. Those who had been watching the negotiations closely had noted the warning signs throughout. The delayed sessions, the terse statements from spokesmen, the body language of officials who emerged for brief breaks looking worn and frustrated rather than cautiously optimistic. By the time the final session ended and both delegations prepared to depart Islamabad without even a framework agreement, without so much as a shared statement of principles, it became devastatingly clear to the world that the war was not ending. The ceasefire, already strained by violations on both sides in the days leading up to the talks, would now face its most severe test yet. Communities in Iran that had just begun to send their displaced residents home, hospitals that had begun rotating their exhausted medical staff with some semblance of normalcy, families who had dared to speak cautiously about returning to something resembling ordinary life, all of them would now have to confront the reality that the fighting was far from finished. Thousands had already died, with the overwhelming majority of casualties recorded on Iranian soil, where American air power and the sustained pressure of a technologically superior military force had inflicted damage on infrastructure, military installations, and tragically, civilian areas that would take generations to repair even. In the best of circumstances, the economic consequences of the conflict had already begun rippling outward far beyond the borders of either nation, with global oil and gas prices climbing sharply since the war began more than 6 weeks ago, squeezing household budgets from Jakarta to Johannesburg, from Sao Paulo to Seoul as energy markets absorbed the shock of disruption to one of the world's most strategically vital regions. The failure in Islamabad did not just mean more fighting between two nations, it meant more pain for the entire world, more volatility in markets already made nervous by years of geopolitical uncertainty, and more proof that the international system's ability to enforce peace and compel compromise between powerful adversaries remains dangerously limited when the will to make difficult concessions is absent from the negotiating table. When both delegations emerged from the Islamabad talks and faced the cameras and microphones of the assembled international press corps, what followed was a dispiriting but entirely predictable ritual of mutual recrimination that told observers everything they needed to know about why 21 hours of negotiations had produced absolutely nothing of substance. The American side was unambiguous in placing responsibility for the collapse squarely on Tehran, arguing that Iranian negotiators had arrived in Islamabad not with a genuine desire to reach a lasting peace but with a set of demands so expansive and so non-negotiable that they amounted to a precondition for American surrender rather than a framework for mutual compromise. Washington's representatives pointed to Iran's insistence on ironclad security guarantees that would effectively prevent the United States from ever again using military force in the broader Middle Eastern region, a demand that American officials described as not only unrealistic, but constitutionally and politically impossible to deliver given the structure of American government and the enduring strategic interests that Washington has maintained in the region for decades. The Iranians, for their part, told a completely different story. Tehran's negotiators and the officials who subsequently briefed Iranian state media argued that it was the United States that had come to Islamabad in bad faith, presenting what they characterized as a take-it-or-leave-it ultimatum dressed up in the language of diplomacy, demanding Iranian concessions on its nuclear program, its ballistic missile capabilities, and its regional relationships that went far beyond anything Iran could accept without effectively dismantling the pillars of its national defense strategy. Iranian officials argued with visible anger that their country had already paid an enormous and unconscionable price in this conflict in lives lost, in cities damaged, in an economy crushed by both the war itself and the sanctions regime that the United States had maintained and intensified over years, and that asking Iran to make further concessions under these conditions was not negotiation but coercion. The gap between these two narratives was not merely a matter of spin or public relations strategy. It reflected a genuine and profound divergence in how each side understood the fundamental nature of the conflict, its causes, its conduct, and the terms on which it could legitimately be ended. For Washington, the war had begun as a response to Iranian actions, missile strikes, proxy operations, threats to American allies, and personnel, and any peace agreement had to include binding commitments that would prevent Iran from reconstituting the capabilities and relationships that had made those actions possible. For Tehran, the war was the latest chapter in a long history of American aggression and interference in Iranian affairs dating back generations. And any peace agreement that did not include meaningful constraints on American military power in the region would simply be a pause before the next American-initiated confrontation. Pakistan, which had worked quietly and persistently for weeks to arrange and host these talks, found itself in the deeply uncomfortable position of a gracious host whose dinner party had ended in a shouting match. Pakistani officials, who had hoped that successfully brokering a peace agreement between Washington and Tehran might elevate their country's standing as a serious diplomatic actor at a moment when Pakistan itself faces enormous domestic and economic challenges, were left with nothing but the memory of effort and the reality of failure. The collapse of the Islamabad talks was a blow not just to the two warring parties but to the idea of Pakistani diplomatic mediation itself, and to the broader principle that neutral third-party engagement could bridge the chasm between adversaries who fundamentally do not trust each other and who enter negotiations carrying the accumulated grievances of decades of hostile interaction. With the negotiations in ruins and the diplomats flying home to capitals where hawks on both sides would feel vindicated in their long-standing skepticism about the possibility of a negotiated settlement, the question that hung over the world on Sunday evening was both simple and terrifying: what happens next? The ceasefire that had provided the diplomatic space for the Islamabad talks was already showing severe signs of strain before the negotiations even began, and now, with the talks having collapsed so publicly and so completely, the political incentives on both sides to maintain even a partial and imperfect pause in the fighting were rapidly diminishing. Military planners in Washington, who had argued throughout the ceasefire period that pausing operations had given Iran time to regroup, resupply, and harden its remaining defensive positions, would now find their arguments carrying far greater weight in internal deliberations. Iranian commanders who had used the ceasefire to assess damage, reorganize surviving forces, and prepare contingency plans for resumed American strikes would now be accelerating those preparations with grim urgency. The international community, watching all of this unfold with a sense of helpless alarm, scrambled to respond. The United Nations Secretary-General issued an urgent statement calling on both sides to return to negotiations and to refrain from any actions that would further destabilize an already catastrophic situation. But statements from Turtle Bay, however well-intentioned, have rarely been sufficient to restrain determined military powers when they have concluded that their core interests require the use of force. European governments, many of which had been quietly supporting the Pakistani-mediated peace process through back-channel communications and diplomatic pressure on both Washington and Tehran, convened emergency meetings to discuss what leverage, if any, they retained to prevent a full resumption of hostilities. China, which had its own complex set of interests in both Iran and in the broader question of American military primacy in the Middle Eastern and Gulf regions, sent diplomatic signals through multiple channels urging restraint while carefully avoiding any commitment that might draw Beijing more directly into a confrontation between Washington and Tehran. The energy markets, which had spent the duration of the Islamabad talks in a state of nervous anticipation, reacted to the news of the collapse with immediate and significant movement, as traders and analysts absorbed the reality that the disruption to regional oil supplies that had already sent prices soaring was likely to continue and potentially intensify if full-scale combat operations resumed. For the millions of ordinary Iranians who had lived through more than 6 weeks of war, who had buried their dead, fled their homes, watched their hospitals overwhelmed, and their infrastructure degraded, the collapse of the Islamabad talks was not an abstraction or a geopolitical development to be analyzed at a comfortable distance. It was a sentence. It meant more nights in shelters, more names added to lists of the dead, more children growing up in the shadow of a conflict that their government and the world's most powerful nation had failed to resolve through words and had therefore chosen to continue resolving through destruction. The road back to the negotiating table, if it exists at all, will be longer, harder, and more costly in human terms than the road that led to Islamabad, because every day of resumed fighting adds new grievances, new losses, and new reasons for both sides to harden their positions and distrust each other more completely. Peace, which had seemed within reach if only barely on the morning of Sunday's talks, now feels further away than it has at any point since this terrible war began, and the world can only watch and hope and mourn what was lost in those 21 hours in Islamabad when two nations had their best chance to choose differently and chose instead to walk away.